The moment my father looked across the dinner table and said, "Jessica, you're 32 years old and still haven't made anything of yourself. You're just a disappointment." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just sat there, staring at my untouched plate of meatloaf, letting his words hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What my parents didn't know was that the quiet man sitting at the far end of their dining room table, the one they'd barely acknowledged all evening, was Michael Thompson, the CEO of TechVision Industries. The same Michael Thompson, who had spent the last 6 months trying to convince me to accept a position as their Chief Innovation Officer. The same position that came with a salary that would make my father's yearly income look like pocket change. My name is Jessica Martinez, and for most of my adult life, I've been the invisible daughter, the one who never quite measured up to my siblings' obvious successes. Sarah, my older sister, became a pediatric surgeon who saves children's lives and drives a Mercedes that sparkles in our parents' driveway like a trophy. Kevin, my younger brother, owns 3 successful restaurants across Denver and gets featured in food magazines with his perfectly styled beard and expensive chef's jackets. Then there's me, the middle child who works with computers. Or at least that's how my parents explain my career to their friends at church. The truth is more complicated, but I stopped trying to explain it years ago. I'm a software architect and systems designer. I create the invisible infrastructure that keeps major corporations running. I solve problems that most people don't even know exist. I've spent the last 8 years building my reputation quietly, steadily, without fanfare or flashy headlines. My work speaks for itself in boardrooms and server farms, in the smooth functioning of applications that millions of people use daily, without ever thinking about the person who designed the backbone that makes it all possible. But to my parents, David and Linda Martinez, I'm still the awkward teenager who spent too much time on her computer instead of dating or playing sports. I'm the daughter who chose a state university over the prestigious schools my siblings attended. I'm the one who wears jeans to family gatherings instead of the polished, professional attire that screams success in their language of appearances and social status. The family dinner that changed everything started like all the others. Mom called on a Tuesday, her voice carrying that familiar mixture of obligation and mild irritation that I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Jessica, we're having dinner on Sunday. Sarah's bringing the new boyfriend, the one who works at the hospital with her. Kevin's coming with that lovely girl Amanda. You should come too. Maybe bring someone if you're seeing anyone, though I suppose you're probably too busy with your computer work to date much." I almost declined. These gatherings had become exercises in endurance. 2-hour stretches where I smiled politely while my parents cataloged my siblings' achievements and asked me vague, dismissive questions about my job. But something made me say yes this time. Maybe it was the conversation I'd had earlier that week with Emma, my closest friend from college who now works in venture capital. "Jess, you realize you're probably one of the most sought-after architects in the city, right?" Emma had said over coffee at our usual spot downtown. "Half the tech companies in Denver would kill to have you on their team. That project you just finished for Mountain View Financial? That's going to revolutionize how they handle transactions. You're brilliant, and you need to start acting like it." Emma always believed in me more than I believed in myself. She was the one who encouraged me to leave my comfortable but limiting position at a mid-sized firm 3 years ago to go freelance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She was the one who celebrated with champagne when I landed my first major contract, designing security protocols for a healthcare network that processes patient data for 47 hospitals across the western states. She was also the one who kept pushing me to consider the offers that had started coming in with increasing frequency over the past year. The offers I hadn't told my family about. The headhunters who called monthly. The meetings I'd been taking with companies whose names would make my parents' eyes widen with recognition and respect. I kept telling myself I was being modest, staying grounded, not getting ahead of myself. But the truth was scarier than that. I was terrified that if I reached for something bigger, if I stepped into the spotlight and failed, it would confirm everything my parents had always quietly believed about me. So I said yes to the dinner, thinking maybe this time would be different. Maybe I'd find a way to bridge the gap between who they thought I was and who I'd actually become. Maybe I'd finally tell them about the success I'd been building in careful, deliberate steps. Sunday arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that makes Denver feel like the best place on earth. I drove to my childhood home in Lakewood, a modest ranch house in a neighborhood where the lawns are perfectly maintained and everyone knows each other's business. The house looked exactly the same as it had when I left for college 14 years ago. Same beige siding, same red front door, same garden gnomes that my mother insisted gave the place character. Sarah's Mercedes was already in the driveway, parked next to Kevin's black BMW. I pulled my reliable but unremarkable Honda Civic behind them, the automotive equivalent of showing up to a black tie event in khakis. Through the living room window, I could see the warm glow of the dining room lights and the silhouettes of my family already gathered around the table. I took a deep breath, grabbed the bottle of wine I'd brought, and walked toward what I thought would be just another uncomfortable family dinner. I had no idea I was walking into the night that would change everything between us forever. Mom opened the door before I could knock, enveloping me in the familiar scent of her perfume and the roast that had been cooking all afternoon. "Jessica, sweetheart, you made it. Come in, come in. Everyone's already here." She looked past me toward the driveway with barely concealed hope. "Just you tonight?" "Just me, Mom," I said, handing her the wine. It was a good bottle, something I'd picked up from a boutique winery during a work trip to California. But I knew she'd set it aside without looking at the label and open one of the mass-market brands she bought in bulk from the grocery store. The dining room was exactly as I remembered from countless Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, and birthday celebrations. The oak table that Dad had built himself in the garage 20 years ago dominated the space, surrounded by mismatched chairs that somehow worked together. Mom's good china was set out carefully, the plates with tiny blue flowers that she'd inherited from her mother and only used for special occasions and family gatherings. Sarah was already seated, looking polished and professional even in casual clothes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, and she wore a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in 3 months. Next to her sat Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, the cardiologist she'd been dating for 6 months. He was handsome in that effortless way that some people are blessed with, all straight teeth and confident posture. Kevin had claimed his usual spot across from Sarah, wearing a button-down shirt that showcased the fact that he actually had time to work out between managing his restaurants. Amanda, his girlfriend of 2 years, sat beside him looking like she'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. She worked in marketing for a luxury hotel chain and had the kind of easy sophistication that came from growing up with money and expectations. The empty chair waiting for me was at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen, the spot that had been mine since childhood, the spot that somehow always felt a little separate from the main conversation, a little removed from the center of attention where my siblings naturally gravitated. But as I approached the table, I noticed something unexpected. There was another person I didn't recognize sitting in what was usually Dad's chair at the head of the table. A man in his early 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes, wearing a simple navy sweater and jeans. He looked comfortable, but not quite like he belonged to this particular family dynamic. "Jessica," Dad said, standing up from his relocated spot near Mom's end of the table, "I'd like you to meet Michael Thompson. He's Amanda's boss at the hotel company." "Michael, this is our middle daughter Jessica. She works with computers." Michael stood and extended his hand with a genuine smile. "Nice to meet you, Jessica. Amanda's told me a lot about your family." His handshake was firm, his voice warm, and something about the way he looked at me suggested he was actually interested in meeting me, not just going through polite motions. "Nice to meet you too," I replied, settling into my assigned chair. I felt that familiar flutter of anxiety that came with family dinners, the sense that I was about to spend the next 2 hours being reminded of all the ways I hadn't lived up to their expectations. Mom bustled around the table, filling water glasses and making sure everyone had everything they needed. Michael was just telling us about the hotel business. Apparently, Amanda's been doing wonderful work on some big marketing campaign. Amanda glowed under the attention. "It's really exciting. We're launching a new luxury brand targeted at business travelers. High-end amenities, concierge services, that whole experience. Michael's been incredibly supportive of my ideas." Amanda has a natural talent for understanding what drives customer loyalty, Michael said. She's going to go far in this industry. I watched the familiar dance begin, the praise, the questions about career advancement, the interested nods from my parents. This was the language they understood. Titles, recognition, clear markers of success that could be easily explained and celebrated. I took a sip of water and prepared to fade into the background, as I always did. And Sarah, Mom continued, turning to my sister, tell Michael about the research you've been doing. She's working on some groundbreaking procedure for children with heart defects. Sarah launched into an explanation of her latest project, her voice animated in the way it always became when she talked about her work. She was genuinely passionate about what she did, and I had nothing but admiration for her dedication to helping children. But listening to her describe the recognition she'd received, the conferences where she'd presented her findings, the medical journal that wanted to publish her research, I felt the familiar weight of comparison settling on my shoulders. Kevin jumped in when Sarah finished, sharing news about his third restaurant's opening and the food critic from the Denver Post, who'd given it a rave review. We're booked solid for the next 6 weeks, he said with obvious pride. I might need to start looking for a fourth location sooner than I planned. That's wonderful, honey, Mom beamed. Your father and I are so proud of both of you. You've both built such impressive careers. The statement hung in the air with an obvious omission. Both of you. Not all three of you. I cut a piece of roast beef and chewed it carefully, tasting nothing. What about you, Jessica? Michael asked, and something about his tone was different from the polite but disinterested way most people asked about my work. What kind of computer work do you do? Before I could answer, Dad jumped in with his standard explanation. Oh, Jessica fixes things when they break. Computer problems, that sort of thing. It's steady work, but not exactly what you'd call a career, with much growth potential. I felt my cheeks burn. Actually, I don't really do tech support. I'm more of a, she's very good with computers, Mom interrupted, clearly wanting to say something positive, but not really understanding what that meant. She helped us set up our new router last Christmas. Michael's eyebrows raised slightly, and I caught something in his expression that might have been recognition. But before I could clarify what I actually did for a living, the conversation had moved on to Amanda's upcoming promotion and the company retreat they were planning in Aspen. I spent the rest of dinner in my familiar role as the quiet observer, nodding and smiling while my siblings and their significant others shared stories of professional triumphs and future plans. Michael participated in the conversation, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights about business and leadership that suggested he had more experience than just running hotel marketing campaigns. But every so often I caught him glancing in my direction, and I had the strange feeling that he was studying me, trying to figure something out. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but it was unusual. Most people at these family gatherings either ignored me entirely or asked polite questions they didn't really want answers to. As Mom served dessert, her famous apple pie that she'd been making the same way for 30 years, the conversation turned to future plans and goals. Sarah talked about the fellowship opportunity she was considering in Boston. Kevin discussed his dreams of expanding beyond Denver, maybe opening restaurants in other Colorado cities. What about you, Jessica? Amanda asked, and I could tell she was trying to be kind, to include me in the conversation. Any big plans coming up? The table went quiet, all eyes turning toward me with that mixture of polite interest and low expectations that I'd grown accustomed to. This was usually the moment where I'd mumble something about staying busy with work, maybe mention a small project or two, nothing that would require much follow-up or attention. But something about Michael's presence, the way he'd been listening carefully to everything that was said, made me hesitate. I opened my mouth to give my usual non-answer, then closed it again. I'm considering some new opportunities, I said finally. There's been interest from several companies about potential positions. That's nice, dear, Mom said absently, already starting to clear plates. Maybe something with better benefits than the freelance work. Dad nodded. Stability is important, Jessica. You can't keep jumping around from project to project forever. At some point, you need to settle into something permanent, something with a future. I felt the familiar sting of their assumptions, the way they reduced my carefully built career to jumping around and instability. I'd been supporting myself comfortably for years, building a reputation that opened doors I'd never even imagined. But to them, I was still the daughter who hadn't figured out her life yet. Actually, I started to say, thinking maybe this was the moment to finally tell them about the offers, about the recognition my work had been getting, about the position with TechVision that could change everything. But Dad was already moving on, turning to Kevin with a question about the restaurant's wine selection, and the moment passed. I sat back in my chair, that familiar feeling of invisibility settling over me like a heavy blanket. Michael, however, was still watching me, and when our eyes met across the table, I saw something there that surprised me. It wasn't pity or polite disinterest. It looked almost like understanding, like he knew exactly what it felt like to be underestimated, to have your words dismissed before you'd even finished speaking them. The evening wound down with the usual rituals. Coffee in the living room, scattered conversations about family members who weren't there, Mom showing everyone photos from her recent trip to visit her sister in Phoenix. I helped clear the dishes, loading the dishwasher while listening to the animated discussion happening in the next room about Sarah's upcoming conference presentation. As I was wiping down the counter, Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Can I help with anything?" "Oh, that's not necessary," I said, hanging up the dish towel. "I've got it covered." He stepped into the kitchen anyway, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "So, software architecture," he said quietly. I froze, my hand still on the towel. "I'm sorry." "That's what you do, isn't it? Software architecture and systems design." "Not tech support." The kitchen suddenly felt very small. "How did you? Your name came up in a meeting a few weeks ago." Someone mentioned a Jessica Martinez who designed the new transaction processing system for Mountain View Financial. Apparently it's revolutionary. Reduced their processing time by 60% while improving security protocols. He paused, studying my face. "That was you, wasn't it?" I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice. "Impressive work," he continued. "I've been in tech long enough to know that kind of improvement doesn't happen by accident. It takes someone who really understands both the technical and business sides of the equation." "Thank you," I managed. Michael glanced toward the living room where my family's voices continued their animated discussion of Sarah's medical research. "They don't know, do they? About what you actually do, the level you're working at." I shook my head. "It's complicated. They see computers and think tech support." I've tried to explain, but I trailed off, not sure how to articulate years of feeling misunderstood without sounding like I was making excuses. "I get it," he said simply. "Sometimes the people closest to us have the hardest time seeing who we've become versus who they remember us being." There was something in his voice that suggested he spoke from experience, but before I could ask what he meant, Amanda appeared in the doorway. "There you are," she said to Michael. "We should probably get going soon. Early morning tomorrow." "Of course," he replied, then turned back to me. "It was really nice meeting you, Jessica. I hope we get a chance to talk more sometime." As they gathered their coats and said their goodbyes, I felt like something important had just happened, though I wasn't sure exactly what. Michael shook hands with my parents, thanked them for dinner, and complimented Mom on the apple pie. But as he was leaving, he handed me a business card. "In case you ever want to continue our conversation about architecture," he said with a meaningful look, "I think you'd find some of our current projects interesting." I glanced down at the card and felt my breath catch. Michael Thompson, Chief Executive Officer, TechVision Industries. The same TechVision that had been courting me for months. The same CEO whose assistant had called 3 times in the past 2 weeks, trying to schedule a meeting. By the time I looked up, he was already walking toward Amanda's car, leaving me standing in my parents' doorway with a business card that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Sarah and Marcus left shortly after Michael and Amanda, with promises to call soon and plans for lunch the following week. Kevin lingered a bit longer, but even he eventually gathered his things and headed home, leaving me alone with my parents for the first time all evening. "That Michael seems like a nice man," Mom said, settling into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea. "Amanda's lucky to have such a supportive boss. Very professional. Dad agreed, muting the television but leaving the Sunday night movie playing silently in the background. You can tell he's successful, confident, well-spoken, the kind of man who's going places. I sat on the couch, still turning Michael's business card over in my hands, still processing the impossibility of the evening. The CEO of one of Denver's fastest-growing tech companies had spent the evening at my parents' dinner table, had heard them dismiss my career as computer repair work, had watched me sit quietly while my siblings received praise for achievements that, while impressive, operated in completely different leagues from the kind of work I'd been doing. "You were quiet tonight," Mom observed, not unkindly. "Everything okay?" I looked at my parents, these people who had raised me, who loved me in their own way, who genuinely wanted the best for me even if they didn't understand what that looked like. I thought about all the times I'd sat in this same living room, listening to them worry about my future, express their hopes that I'd find something more stable, more respectable, more like what Sarah and Kevin had built. I thought about the business card in my hand, about the phone calls I'd been avoiding, about the offer that could change everything not just for my career, but for how my family saw me, how they understood the work I'd been doing all these years. "I'm fine," I said finally, "just tired." But as I drove home to my apartment that night, Michael's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes the people closest to us have the hardest time seeing who we've become versus who they remember us being. I'd spent so many years accepting their version of my story, their understanding of my choices and capabilities, that I'd almost started believing it myself. Almost. But not quite. Because deep down I knew what I'd accomplished. I knew the problems I'd solved, the systems I'd built, the recognition I'd earned from people who understood the complexity and value of my work. I'd just been too afraid to claim it, too worried about seeming arrogant or getting ahead of myself. But maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to let my family see who I'd actually become. I pulled into my parking space and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the business card one more time. Tomorrow, I decided, I would call TechVision. I would take the meeting I'd been avoiding. And maybe, just maybe, I would finally stop letting other people's limitations define my possibilities. The disappointment I'd felt at dinner was still there, that familiar ache of being misunderstood and undervalued. But underneath it, something else was growing. Something that felt like determination, like the quiet confidence that comes from finally deciding to stop hiding your light under other people's expectations. My parents thought I was a disappointment. They'd made that clear in countless small ways over the years, in every conversation that glazed over my work, every gathering where my achievements went unmentioned while my siblings' successes were celebrated. But what if they were wrong? What if the problem wasn't that I hadn't accomplished anything worth celebrating, but that I'd never given them the chance to see what I'd actually built? As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I found myself thinking about Michael's recognition, about the way he'd known immediately who I was and what my work meant. If the CEO of TechVision Industries knew my name, knew my reputation, valued my contributions enough to spend months trying to recruit me, maybe it was time I started valuing them that way too. Maybe it was time to stop being the disappointment and start being the success I'd actually become. The phone call came at 7:30 Monday morning, while I was still in my pajamas nursing my first cup of coffee and trying to shake off the lingering effects of Sunday's family dinner. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer instead of letting it go to voicemail. "Jessica Martinez?" The voice was crisp, professional, with just a hint of urgency. Speaking. "This is Rachel Chen from TechVision Industries. I'm Mr. Thompson's executive assistant. He asked me to reach out this morning about scheduling a meeting with you at your earliest convenience." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. Less than 12 hours after sitting at my parents' dinner table, listening to them explain my career as computer repair work, while the CEO of TechVision sat 3 feet away, his assistant was calling to arrange a meeting I'd been putting off for months. Yes, I stammered, setting down my mug with shaking hands. "When did you have in mind?" "Would this afternoon work? Say, 2 o'clock?" Mr. Thompson had a cancellation, and specifically asked if we could move quickly on this. I agreed, before my rational mind could start listing all the reasons I wasn't ready. Why I needed more time to prepare. why I should wait until I felt more confident about taking such a big step. By the time I hung up, I had 4 hours to transform myself from the invisible daughter who sat quietly through family dinners into someone worthy of a meeting with one of Denver's most successful tech executives. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, I'd been building a reputation that apparently reached the highest levels of the industry. Projects I'd completed were generating millions in savings for major corporations. Systems I'd designed were processing thousands of transactions daily without a single security breach. Yet I still felt like I was pretending to be someone more important than I actually was. I spent the morning second-guessing everything. My portfolio, which suddenly seemed thin despite containing some of the most complex work I'd ever done. My resume, which looked inadequate next to the magnitude of what TechVision was offering. My entire approach to my career, which had been built on quiet competence rather than self-promotion. But as I drove downtown to TechVision's offices, housed in a gleaming 30-story building that dominated Denver's tech corridor, I found myself thinking about something else entirely. I thought about the look on my father's face when he'd introduced me to Michael as the daughter who works with computers. The dismissive tone when he'd described my work as having no growth potential. The way my mother had tried to find something positive to say and landed on helping them set up a router. These weren't cruel people. They loved me, worried about me, wanted me to succeed. But somewhere along the way, they'd formed an image of who I was and what I was capable of, and that image had calcified into something that felt impossible to change. Every family gathering reinforced it. Every polite inquiry about my work that ended with glazed eyes and quick subject changes. Every time my siblings' achievements were celebrated while mine were overlooked or misunderstood. I'd started accepting their version of my story. Not completely, but enough to make me cautious about reaching too high. About claiming too much success, about appearing to think too highly of myself. Enough to make me turn down opportunities that felt too big, too visible, too likely to fail spectacularly, and confirm their worst fears about my judgment. The TechVision lobby was everything you'd expect from a company that had grown from startup to industry leader in less than a decade. Polished marble floors, abstract art that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a reception area that managed to feel both welcoming and intimidating. I gave my name to the receptionist, a young woman with the kind of effortless professionalism that came from working somewhere important. Ms. Martinez, welcome to TechVision. Mr. Thompson is expecting you. I'll let Rachel know you're here. I sat in one of the leather chairs, trying to look like I belonged while my mind raced through every possible way this meeting could go wrong. What if Michael had somehow confused me with someone else? What if Sunday night's conversation had given him the wrong impression of my capabilities? What if I walked into that conference room and proved every doubt my family had ever had about my judgment? Jessica? I looked up to find a woman in her 30s approaching, wearing a navy blazer and the kind of confident smile that suggested she was used to putting nervous visitors at ease. I'm Rachel Chen. Mr. Thompson is ready for you. She led me through corridors lined with awards and accolades, past conference rooms where serious-looking people gestured at presentations projected on smartboards, past offices where the soft hum of innovation felt almost tangible. We stopped at a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Rocky Mountains. Michael stood up from behind a desk that managed to look both executive and approachable, extending his hand with the same genuine warmth he'd shown at my parents' house. But there was something different about him here, in his own environment, an authority and confidence that had been carefully muted during Sunday's family dinner. Jessica, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, have a seat. The office was impressive without being ostentatious. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with technical manuals and business strategy guides. A second wall displayed framed patents and industry awards. But what caught my attention was a third wall covered with what looked like system diagrams and flowcharts, the kind of technical documentation that most CEOs would delegate to their engineering teams. You design systems yourself, I said, nodding toward the wall. Michael followed my gaze and smiled. Old habits. I started as a programmer 25 years ago. Built my first company from my garage, writing code until 3 in the morning and surviving on coffee and stubbornness. Even now, I like to stay close to the technical side of what we do. He gestured to the chairs arranged around a small conference table near the windows. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be great, thank you." As he poured from a carafe that looked like it had been freshly made, I found myself studying him more carefully than I'd been able to the night before. This was someone who had built something significant, who had transformed an idea into a company that employed hundreds of people and generated millions in revenue. Yet he'd sat through an entire family dinner listening to my parents dismiss my work without once suggesting they might not understand the full picture. "I have to ask," I said as he handed me the coffee. "Last night, at dinner, you knew who I was, what I do, but you didn't say anything when they described your work as tech support." He settled into the chair across from me, his expression thoughtful. "I learned a long time ago that family dynamics are complicated. Sometimes the most loving families have the hardest time seeing the people right in front of them clearly. It's frustrating," I admitted. "I imagine it is. My own parents spent years worrying I was wasting my education on quote, computer games instead of getting a real job. Even after my first company went public, my mother would introduce me to her friends as her son who, quote, worked with computers, in the same tone your mother used last night. The comparison stung because it was so accurate. But there was something comforting about hearing it from someone who had clearly moved beyond caring what other people thought of his choices. The Mountain View Financial Project," Michael continued, shifting into business mode. "Walk me through your approach to the security protocols." For the next hour, we dove deep into technical details. Not the surface-level conversation that happened at networking events or the simplified explanations I'd learned to give to non-technical audiences, but the kind of detailed, complex discussion that happened between professionals who understood the intricacies of large-scale system design. Michael asked intelligent questions that challenged my assumptions and pushed me to articulate not just what I'd built, but why I'd made specific architectural decisions. He understood the trade-offs between security and performance, the challenges of scaling systems to handle massive transaction volumes, the delicate balance between innovation and reliability that defined enterprise-level software development. "Impressive," he said when I finished explaining the algorithmic improvements that had generated Mountain View's 60% efficiency gain. "Most architects would have approached that problem by throwing more hardware at it. Your solution is elegant and cost-effective." "Thank you. I'm curious about something, though. This level of work, these kinds of results, they don't happen in isolation. You must have other projects generating similar outcomes, other clients seeing comparable improvements." I nodded. The healthcare network project reduced data processing time by 40% while improving HIPAA compliance. The logistics company saw a 30% reduction in shipping errors after implementing the new routing algorithms. The financial services firm hasn't had a single security breach since we redesigned their authentication protocols 18 months ago. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "So why are you still working as an independent contractor instead of building your own company or joining an executive team somewhere?" The question hit closer to home than I'd expected. I guess I've always preferred working behind the scenes, letting the work speak for itself rather than trying to promote myself. "And how's that strategy working out for you?" I thought about Sunday night's dinner, about sitting quietly while my siblings shared their professional triumphs, about the way my parents' eyes glazed over whenever I tried to explain what I actually did for a living. "Not as well as I'd hoped," I said quietly. "Jessica, I'm going to be direct with you. TechVision is at a critical point in our growth. We're moving into enterprise-level contracts that require the kind of sophisticated architecture and security protocols you specialize in. We need someone who can design systems that scale, someone who understands both the technical challenges and the business implications of what we're building." He paused, looking out at the mountains for a moment before turning back to me. "I've been looking for a chief innovation officer for 8 months, someone who can bridge the gap between our development teams and our strategic vision. Someone who can take our current capabilities and transform them into something that positions us as a leader in enterprise solutions rather than just another tech company." "That sounds like an incredible opportunity," I said carefully. "It is. But it's also visible. Very visible. You'd be presenting to board members, leading client meetings, representing the company at industry conferences. You'd have a team of 12 senior developers reporting to you. Your decisions would affect millions of dollars in revenue and hundreds of jobs. I felt that familiar flutter of anxiety, the voice in my head that whispered about getting ahead of myself, about taking on more than I could handle, about the spectacular ways I could fail if I overestimated my abilities. I can see you're thinking about all the ways it could go wrong, Michael said with a slight smile. Let me ask you something. When you designed the Mountain View system, how many potential failure points did you identify? Hundreds. Maybe thousands if you count all the edge cases and integration challenges. And what did you do with that information? Built redundancies, created fallback protocols, tested every scenario I could think of, and several I borrowed from other systems. Exactly. You didn't let the possibility of failure prevent you from building something excellent. You planned for it, prepared for it, and then built something robust enough to handle whatever came up. Michael stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Your family sees you as someone who fixes computers because that's the only framework they have for understanding technology work. But I see something different. I see someone who solves problems that most people don't even know exist. Someone who builds the invisible infrastructure that keeps entire industries running smoothly. He turned back to face me. The question is, what do you see when you look at yourself? I thought about the systems I'd designed, the problems I'd solved, the clients who had seen their operations transformed by my work. I thought about the late nights spent debugging complex code, the satisfaction of watching a system I'd built handle peak loads without breaking, the quiet pride I felt when a project exceeded everyone's expectations. But I also thought about Sunday night's dinner, about the way I'd accepted my parents' description of my work without correction, about how I'd let them reduce years of professional achievement to helping them set up a router. I see someone who's been hiding, I said finally. Someone who's built something significant but hasn't been willing to claim it. And what would it look like if you stopped hiding? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and risk in equal measure. I could feel myself standing at a crossroads, not just professionally but personally. I could continue working behind the scenes, building excellent systems for other companies while remaining invisible to the people who mattered most to me. Or I could step into the spotlight, claim the success I'd earned, and risk everything that came with being seen. It would look like accepting your offer, I said. Michael smiled, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he walked back to his desk and picked up a folder that looked like it had been prepared in advance. Before you make that decision, I want you to understand exactly what you'd be stepping into. This isn't just a job offer, Jessica. This is an opportunity to transform how the industry thinks about enterprise architecture and security. To build something that could influence how companies approach digital infrastructure for the next decade. He opened the folder and spread several documents across the conference table. Financial projections, organizational charts, strategic plans that outline TechVision's expansion into markets I'd only dreamed of working in. We're not just talking about a higher salary or a better title, though both of those are part of the package. We're talking about the chance to shape the future of an industry, to have your name associated with innovations that will outlast both of us. I studied the documents, my heart racing as I began to understand the scope of what he was proposing. This wasn't just a step up from my current work. This was a leap into a completely different league, a level of responsibility and visibility that would change everything about how I approached my career and my life. The salary, I said, looking at the compensation package outlined in the folder, is commensurate with the value you'd bring to the organization, Michael finished, and with the industry standards for executives at your level of expertise. The number was more than my parents had earned in some years combined. More than I'd ever imagined making, even in my most optimistic projections about where my career might lead. There's something else, Michael continued, something that might be particularly relevant given last night's dinner conversation. He pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a major business magazine. We're launching the new position with a feature story about innovation in enterprise architecture. The journalist wants to profile the person we hire, discuss their background and vision for the future of the industry. It would run in the December issue, which happens to be their annual Leaders to Watch edition. I stared at the magazine letterhead, my mind racing through the implications. My parents subscribed to this magazine. My father read it religiously, discussing articles about successful executives and innovative companies, with the kind of enthusiasm he usually reserved for discussing Sarah's medical research or Kevin's restaurant reviews. "You'd be on the cover?" I asked. "That's the plan." Along with a 6-page feature story about your approach to solving enterprise-level security challenges. The room felt suddenly warm. I could picture my parents' faces when they saw that magazine, could imagine my father's expression when he realized that the daughter he'd introduced as someone who works with computers was being featured as an industry leader in a publication he respected. But I could also picture all the ways it could go wrong. What if I wasn't ready for that level of scrutiny? What if the article revealed gaps in my knowledge or experience that I hadn't even considered? What if taking such a visible position exposed me as someone who had been getting by on luck rather than true expertise? "I can see you're spiraling," Michael said gently. "Let me tell you something that might help. 5 years ago, I almost turned down the opportunity to acquire a smaller company that became the foundation for 40% of our current revenue. You know why I almost said no? I shook my head. Because I was afraid I wasn't ready. Afraid I'd overextended myself, taken on more than I could handle. Afraid I'd fail publicly and spectacularly." He sat back down across from me. But my mentor asked me a question that changed my perspective. He said, "If not now, when? And if not you, who?" Michael leaned forward, his expression serious. "Jessica, I've been in this industry for 25 years. I've worked with hundreds of architects and developers. I've seen brilliant technical minds who couldn't communicate with business stakeholders. And I've seen great communicators who didn't understand the technical complexities they were trying to manage. You are the first person I've met who excels at both. But what if you succeed beyond your wildest expectations? What if this becomes the platform that launches you into the kind of career you never imagined possible? What if, 5 years from now, you're running your own company, or advising Fortune 500 executives on digital transformation strategies?" I looked out at the mountains, thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment. Years of quiet work, building skills and reputation while staying safely invisible. Years of accepting other people's limitations on what I could achieve, what I deserved to reach for, what was realistic for someone like me. "I need some time to think about it," I said finally. "Of course. But Jessica, don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait indefinitely. And frankly, neither do I." As I drove home from TechVision's offices, my mind was spinning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. The salary alone would change everything about my life. The visibility would transform how my family, my industry, and I myself understood my capabilities and achievements. But it was more than just the job. It was what accepting the position would represent. A declaration that I was done hiding behind modest self-assessments and other people's limited expectations. A decision to step fully into the success I'd been building quietly for years. That evening, I called Emma and told her about the meeting, about the offer, about the magazine feature that would put my face and name in front of thousands of industry professionals. "Jessica Maria Martinez," she said when I finished, "are you seriously considering turning this down?" "I'm not considering turning it down. I'm just processing." "Processing what? This is everything you've worked for. This is the recognition you deserve for all those late nights and complex projects and brilliant solutions that nobody outside the industry understands. But what if I'm not ready? What if I take this position and prove that everyone who ever doubted me was right?" Emma was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. "Jess, do you remember senior year when you were afraid to apply for that advanced algorithms class because you thought you weren't smart enough? And then you not only passed but finished with the highest grade in the program?" I remembered. Or when you almost didn't take the Mountain View contract because you thought it was too complex for someone with your experience level, and then you delivered a solution that exceeded every expectation they had? I remembered that too. You have a pattern, my friend. You consistently underestimate yourself, then consistently exceed everyone else's expectations. Maybe it's time to trust your track record instead of your anxiety. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment looking out at the Denver skyline, thinking about patterns. The pattern Emma had identified, where I doubted myself, then succeeded beyond what anyone thought possible. But also the other pattern, the one I'd been living with for years. The pattern where I achieved something significant, then downplayed it or hid it, rather than claiming the recognition I'd earned. I thought about Sunday night's dinner, about sitting quietly while my parents explained my career in terms that bore no resemblance to reality, about the way I'd accepted their version of my story instead of correcting it, about how Michael had recognized immediately who I was while my own family remained completely unaware of what I'd accomplished. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe it was time to trust my track record instead of my anxiety. Maybe it was time to stop letting other people's limitations define my possibilities. I picked up my phone and dialed TechVision's main number. Rachel Chen answered on the second ring. "Rachel, this is Jessica Martinez. Could you schedule another meeting with Mr. Thompson? I'd like to discuss the details of that position we talked about today." "Of course, Ms. Martinez. How does tomorrow morning work for you?" "Tomorrow morning is perfect." As I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. Not confidence exactly, but something quieter and more sustainable. The recognition that I'd been preparing for this moment for years without realizing it. Every system I'd designed, every problem I'd solved, every client who had seen their operations transformed by my work had been building toward this opportunity. My parents might not understand what I did for a living, but Michael Thompson did. The CEO of TechVision Industries knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of achieving. And maybe it was time I started knowing it too. The call came 3 weeks after I'd accepted the position at TechVision, just as I was settling into my new office and getting acquainted with my team of senior developers. It was my mother, and her voice carried that particular strain that meant family drama was brewing. "Jessica, honey, we need to talk. Can you come over tonight? Your father and I have something important to discuss with you." My stomach dropped. In my family, important discussions usually meant interventions. The kind where everyone gathered to express their concerns about someone's life choices with the best of intentions and the worst possible timing. "What's this about, Mom?" "Well, we've been hearing some things. Kevin mentioned that Amanda said her boss thinks you're working for his company now. But that doesn't make sense because Amanda's boss runs hotels, not computer repair shops." I closed my eyes, suddenly understanding what was happening. Word was getting out about my new position, filtered through the telephone game of family connections and workplace gossip. Amanda had clearly mentioned something to Kevin about my connection to TechVision, but the details had gotten garbled in translation. "Mom, I can explain." And then Sarah said she heard from someone at the hospital that there's a Jessica Martinez who's been in the news recently for some big business thing. But we told her that couldn't be you because you would have mentioned something that important to your family. The news. My heart started racing. The magazine feature wasn't supposed to run until December, but preliminary coverage had already started appearing in industry publications and local business journals. Michael had warned me this might happen, that success in Denver's relatively small tech community tended to generate buzz before official announcements. "Jessica, we're worried you might be getting mixed up in something over your head. You know how these tech companies can be. They make big promises to get people to work for them, then when things go wrong, it's the employees who suffer." I could hear the genuine concern in her voice, the same tone she'd used when I was 16, and she was worried I was hanging out with the wrong crowd. But now I was 32 years old, and the wrong crowd she was worried about was one of the most successful companies in Denver. "I'll be there at 7, I said. "Good. Your father's making his famous chili, and Sarah and Kevin are coming too. We thought it would be good to have the whole family together for this conversation." An intervention. A full-scale family intervention about my career choices, happening at the exact moment when those choices were finally paying off in ways they couldn't imagine. I spent the rest of the afternoon distracted, barely able to focus on the systems integration meeting I was supposed to be leading. My team, a group of brilliant developers who had initially been skeptical about their new boss, had started looking to me for technical guidance and strategic direction. But all I could think about was facing my family's concerned expressions and well-meaning advice about not getting my hopes up too high. The drive to Lakewood felt longer than usual, my mind churning through possible conversations and explanations. How do you tell people who see you as perpetually struggling that you've just accepted a position that comes with a corner office and a salary that would make their heads spin? How do you explain that the daughter they worry about has been building something significant while they weren't paying attention? I pulled into the familiar driveway behind Sarah's Mercedes and Kevin's BMW, the same automotive hierarchy that had greeted me at every family gathering for years. But this time, instead of feeling like the odd one out, I found myself thinking about the company car that would be arriving next week. A sleek hybrid that came with the executive package, something that would fit seamlessly into this driveway, without looking apologetic or out of place. The smell of Dad's chili greeted me at the front door, along with the familiar sounds of my family gathered in the kitchen. Sarah was setting the table with Mom's good china, the same blue-flowered plates that had marked important family discussions throughout my childhood. Kevin was opening a bottle of wine, something expensive that he'd probably brought from one of his restaurants. "There she is," Dad said, giving me a hug that felt more loaded than usual. "How's our computer expert doing?" "I'm doing well, Dad. Really well, actually." Mom bustled over, taking my coat and studying my face, with the kind of intense scrutiny that mothers deploy when they're worried their children are making poor life decisions. "You look tired, sweetheart. Are you getting enough sleep?" Sometimes when people take on too much, they don't realize how it's affecting them until it's too late. We gathered around the dining room table, the same seats we'd occupied 3 weeks earlier when Michael Thompson had sat quietly listening to my parents describe my career as tech support work. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here I was, back in the same chair, preparing to defend choices that were actually the best I'd ever made. "So," Dad began, ladling chili into bowls with the ceremonial care he always brought to his cooking, "we wanted to talk to you about this new job situation." "What new job situation?" I asked, though I knew exactly what was coming. Sarah exchanged a look with Kevin, one of those sibling communications that happened without words. They'd clearly coordinated their approach to this conversation. "Jess," Sarah said gently, "Amanda mentioned that her boss thinks you're working for their company now, but that doesn't really make sense, given what you do for work." And then Kevin heard from someone at the restaurant supply company that there's been some news coverage about a Jessica Martinez in tech, Kevin added. Which seemed weird because you usually work on small computer problems, not the kind of stuff that makes the news. Mom reached across the table and patted my hand. "Honey, we're just concerned that maybe someone is taking advantage of you. You know how these big companies can be. They make everything sound more important than it really is." I looked around the table at these people who loved me, who had raised me, who genuinely wanted to protect me from what they saw as potential disappointment or exploitation. They had no idea that their concern was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I'd become and what I'd accomplished. "What exactly do you think is happening?" I asked. Dad set down his spoon and leaned forward, his expression serious. "We think someone might be promising you things that sound too good to be true. Big title, important responsibilities, more money than makes sense for someone with your background. And we're worried," Mom continued, "that when it all falls apart, you'll be left worse off than you were before. Sometimes it's better to stick with what you know, what's stable and realistic." "What if it's not too good to be true?" I asked quietly. The table went silent. Sarah and Kevin exchanged another look, this one tinged with the kind of gentle pity reserved for family members who might be losing touch with reality. "Jess," Kevin said carefully, "we love you, and we support whatever makes you happy. But some of the things we've been hearing just don't add up. Amanda said her boss mentioned something about you being a chief something officer? That's not really the kind of position someone moves into from freelance computer repair. Unless," Sarah added, with the diplomatic tone she used with particularly difficult patients, "there's something about your work that we haven't understood. Have you been doing different kinds of projects than what you've told us about?" This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating for weeks. The moment when I had to choose between letting them continue believing their version of my story, or finally telling them the truth about what I'd been building while they weren't paying attention. I haven't been doing computer repair, I said. The admission hung in the air like smoke from Dad's famous chili, which was always a little too spicy, but no one ever complained because he was so proud of the recipe. What do you mean? Mom asked. I mean, I haven't been fixing computers or doing tech support. I haven't been doing that kind of work for years. Then what have you been doing? Dad asked, his voice carrying the kind of patience reserved for conversations with confused relatives. I took a deep breath, looking around the table at their expectant faces. These were good people who had supported me through college, who had celebrated my small victories and worried about my setbacks. But they had never really understood what I did for a living, and I had enabled that misunderstanding by accepting their simplified explanations rather than correcting them. I designed enterprise software systems, large-scale architecture for major corporations, the kind of systems that process millions of transactions and handle sensitive data for companies with thousands of employees. Sarah blinked. Like what kind of companies? Mountain View Financial, Rocky Mountain Healthcare Network, Denver Logistics Solutions, some of the biggest companies in the state. Kevin frowned. But you work from home. On your laptop. Because most of my work is designing and testing systems remotely. I don't need to be in a traditional office to write code or architect database structures. And they pay you enough to live on? Mom asked, her voice carrying the doubt of someone who had spent years worrying about my financial stability. They pay me very well. More than enough to live on. Dad was shaking his head slowly, the way he did when trying to process information that didn't fit his existing framework for understanding the world. Jessica, sweetheart, I think there might be some confusion here. The kind of work you're describing, that's what people with advanced degrees do. People with years of training and certifications. I have an advanced degree, Dad. I have a master's in computer science from UC Boulder. I graduated summa cum laude. But that was just a regular computer degree, Mom said. Not the kind that leads to working with major corporations. I realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that they had never really understood my education either. They had celebrated my graduation, been proud that I'd finished school, but they had never grasped what I'd actually studied or what it qualified me to do. Computer science isn't a regular computer degree, Mom. It's advanced mathematics, algorithm design, systems theory, software engineering, the same kind of technical training that engineers get, but focused on digital systems instead of bridges or buildings. Sarah was looking at me with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been recognition. As a doctor, she understood the difference between surface-level knowledge and deep technical expertise. The healthcare network project you mentioned, she said slowly. What did you actually do for them? I redesigned their patient data management system. 47 hospitals across 4 states were having problems with data security and processing speed. I created a new architecture that improved their HIPAA compliance while reducing data retrieval time by 40%. 40%, Sarah repeated. That's actually significant. It's more than significant, I said. It's the kind of improvement that saves hospitals millions of dollars and potentially saves lives by giving doctors faster access to critical patient information. Kevin was staring at me like I was speaking a foreign language. But when we ask about your work, you always say it's complicated and change the subject. Because every time I try to explain what I actually do, your eyes glaze over, and someone changes the subject. It's easier to let you think I fix computers than to keep trying to explain systems architecture to people who don't want to understand it. The accusation was harsher than I'd intended, but years of frustration were finally boiling over. Years of being dismissed, of having my accomplishments minimized, of accepting their version of my story because it was easier than fighting for recognition. That's not fair, Mom said, her voice hurt. We've always been interested in your work. No. You've always been interested in whether my work was stable and whether I was making enough money to take care of myself. You've never been interested in what I actually do or whether I'm good at it. Dad set down his spoon with more force than necessary. Now wait just a minute. We've always supported your choices, even when we didn't understand them. We've never criticized your work or made you feel bad about your career. You introduced me as someone who fixes computers to a man who knew me by reputation as one of the top software architects in Denver. You did it 3 weeks ago, right here at this table." "Amanda's boss?" Kevin asked. "He knew who you were?" Michael Thompson, the CEO of TechVision Industries, knew exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished. He'd been trying to recruit me for months. "And you introduced me as the daughter who works with computers." The table went completely silent. Even the familiar sounds of the house seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "TechVision Industries," Sarah said slowly. "I've heard of them. They're supposed to be one of the most successful tech companies in the state. They are. And 3 weeks ago, Michael Thompson offered me the position of Chief Innovation Officer. I accepted." Dad's chili was getting cold in bowls around the table, but no one seemed to notice. My family was staring at me like I'd just announced I was moving to Mars. "Chief Innovation Officer," Mom repeated. "That sounds important." "It is important. I have a team of 12 senior developers reporting to me. I am responsible for the technical strategy that will guide the company's expansion into enterprise-level contracts worth millions of dollars." "How much money?" Kevin asked, and I could see him doing mental calculations comparing whatever he was imagining to his own restaurant profits. I told them. Not because I wanted to brag, but because I was tired of being seen as someone who was barely getting by. Tired of their worried looks and gentle suggestions about finding something more stable. The number landed on the dinner table like a small explosion. Dad actually choked on his wine. Mom's eyes went wide with the kind of shock usually reserved for natural disasters or lottery winners. "That's more than I make," Sarah said quietly, and she was a specialized surgeon at Denver's largest hospital. "That's more than all 3 of my restaurants combined," Kevin added, his voice hollow with disbelief. "And that's just the base salary," I continued. "There are performance bonuses, stock options, and a comprehensive benefits package that includes things I didn't even know were possible." Mom was shaking her head slowly, like she was trying to wake up from a particularly vivid dream. "But Jessica, honey, if this is all true, why didn't you tell us before? Why did you let us think you were struggling?" The question hit at the heart of everything that had been building between us for years. Why had I hidden my success? Why had I accepted their diminished version of my achievements? Why had I chosen invisibility over recognition? Because every time I tried to tell you about a project or an accomplishment, you either didn't understand it or you minimized it. Because you were more comfortable thinking of me as someone who needed protection than someone who was building something significant. Because I got tired of feeling like I had to prove myself to people who had already decided what I was capable of achieving. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, loaded with years of accumulated frustration and disappointment. But they were also true, painfully and completely true. "We never meant to make you feel that way," Dad said, his voice subdued. "I know you didn't, but that's what happened anyway." Sarah was looking at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before. Not pity or concern, but respect. Professional recognition from someone who understood what it meant to excel in a demanding field. "The magazine coverage Kevin mentioned," she said. "That's about you, isn't it? About this new position?" Business Weekly is doing a feature story about innovation in enterprise architecture. 6 pages, December issue. I'm going to be on the cover. The cover of Business Weekly, the magazine my father read religiously, whose success stories he discussed with the same enthusiasm other people reserved for sports or entertainment. The publication he'd used as a reference point for real achievement, real success, real recognition. "The cover," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, "along with interviews about my approach to solving large-scale technical challenges and my vision for the future of enterprise software development." We sat in silence for several minutes. The family dinner that was supposed to be an intervention about my poor life choices transformed into something none of us had anticipated. The chili was definitely cold now, but no one seemed interested in eating. "I don't understand," Mom said finally. "If you've been this successful, if you've been doing this level of work, why have you been so secretive about it? Why didn't you share this with us?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for weeks. Why had I chosen to remain invisible rather than claiming the recognition I'd earned? Why had I accepted their version of my story instead of insisting on the truth? Because I was afraid, I said. Afraid that if I told you how well things were going, you'd expect me to maintain that level of success indefinitely. Afraid that if I failed at something big and visible, it would be worse than succeeding at something small and invisible. But you haven't failed, Kevin pointed out. You've done the opposite of failing. I know that now, but for years I've been playing it safe, accepting your limitations on what I should reach for instead of trusting my own judgment about what was possible. Dad was staring at his hands, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, his eyes were different. Not the indulgent concern I was used to seeing, but something that looked almost like awe. Business Weekly, he said again. The cover story. The December issue will be on newsstands the first week of December. The article goes into detail about the projects I've completed and the impact they've had on the companies I've worked with. Our Jessica? Mom whispered, and for the first time in years, she sounded like she was seeing me clearly instead of seeing the version of me she'd constructed in her mind. The evening that was supposed to be about their concerns regarding my questionable career choices had become something entirely different. A revelation that changed not just how they saw me, but how I saw myself in relation to them. I was no longer the daughter who needed protection and guidance. I was the daughter who had built something significant while they weren't looking, who had exceeded every expectation they'd had for my life. But as we sat around that familiar table, looking at each other with new understanding, I realized that the biggest revelation wasn't about my career success. It was about the courage it took to finally claim that success, to stop hiding behind other people's limitations, to step fully into the life I'd been building one project at a time. The disappointment they'd expressed so casually just 3 weeks earlier now seemed like it belonged to a different family, a different version of us that no longer existed. In its place was something I'd never experienced before: recognition, respect, and the beginning of a relationship based on who I actually was rather than who they'd assumed me to be. The weeks following that family dinner felt like living in a completely different universe. Suddenly, my parents were calling regularly, not with worried questions about my stability or gentle suggestions about finding something more secure, but with genuine curiosity about my work and what I was building at TechVision. Mom started reading business magazines, something I'd never seen her do in 32 years. She'd call me with questions about articles she'd found, asking me to explain technical concepts that 6 months ago she would have dismissed as too complicated to understand. Dad began mentioning my work to his friends at church, describing me as our daughter who's an executive at one of Denver's biggest tech companies, with a pride that felt both wonderful and surreal. But the most dramatic change was in how Sarah and Kevin treated me. The sibling dynamic that had defined our entire adult relationship shifted almost overnight. Instead of being the little sister who needed guidance and protection, I became someone they came to for advice about their own careers and business decisions. Kevin called me 3 weeks after our family revelation dinner, his voice carrying an excitement I'd never heard when he talked to me about professional matters. Jess, I need your opinion on something. I'm thinking about expanding the restaurant group, but I want to improve our customer data management system first. Is that something you could help me understand? For the first time in our adult lives, my younger brother was asking for my expertise, instead of offering his guidance about my choices. The conversation that followed was technical and complex, covering point-of-sale integration, customer analytics, and digital marketing automation. Kevin listened intently, took notes, and treated my recommendations with the kind of respect he usually reserved for successful business owners and industry experts. Sarah's approach was different, but equally transformative. She started including me in conversations with her medical colleagues, introducing me not as her sister who works with computers, but as a software architect who specialized in healthcare data systems. At a dinner party she hosted for her hospital department, she asked me to explain how electronic health records could be optimized for better patient outcomes. I found myself discussing technical architecture with physicians and administrators, people who understood the critical importance of the systems I designed. One of the senior doctors mentioned that they'd been struggling with data integration issues between their various departments, and by the end of the evening, I had a new consulting contract that would improve care coordination for thousands of patients. But the most significant change wasn't in how my family treated me, it was in how I began to see myself. At TechVision, I was no longer hiding behind modest assessments of my capabilities. When Michael asked for my opinion on strategic decisions, I gave it confidently and comprehensively. When my development team looked to me for technical guidance, I provided it without second-guessing myself or wondering whether I was overstepping my authority. The magazine interview process became a masterclass in claiming my own expertise. The journalist Maria Santos was thorough and knowledgeable, asking detailed questions about my approach to enterprise architecture and my vision for the future of digital infrastructure. "Walk me through the Mountain View financial project," she said during our second interview session. "What made your solution different from what other architects might have proposed?" 6 months ago, I would have downplayed my contributions, focused on the team effort, minimized the innovation involved. But sitting in TechVision's conference room, wearing the kind of professional attire that matched my actual position, rather than apologizing for my presence, I found myself speaking with authority about technical decisions that had generated millions in value. Most architects would have addressed the performance issues by scaling horizontally, adding more servers to handle increased load, I explained. But I identified inefficiencies in the existing algorithm structure that could be resolved through mathematical optimization rather than hardware expansion. And the security improvements? Traditional approaches focus on perimeter defense, building walls around data. My approach integrates security into the fundamental architecture, making every transaction inherently protected rather than relying on external safeguards that can be bypassed. Maria nodded, making notes on her tablet. "You're describing a paradigm shift in how the industry approaches these problems. That's exactly what it is. We're moving from reactive solutions to proactive architecture, from fixing problems to preventing them from occurring in the first place." The confidence in my voice surprised me. This was how I'd always thought about my work internally, but I'd never articulated it so clearly to someone outside the technical community. Speaking with authority about my innovations felt natural in a way that hiding behind modest disclaimers never had. The photo shoot for the magazine cover was another revelation. The photographer, a professional who specialized in executive portraits, treated me like exactly what I was: a successful business leader whose image would represent innovation and achievement to thousands of readers. "Let's capture the confidence," she said, adjusting the lighting. "You're not just another tech worker. You're someone who's transforming how major corporations think about digital infrastructure." Looking at the preliminary shots, I saw someone I barely recognized. Not the awkward middle daughter who faded into the background at family gatherings, but a professional who belonged in boardrooms and industry conferences. Someone whose opinions mattered, whose innovations had impact, whose success was visible and unquestionable. The response from the industry was immediate and overwhelming. Within days of the article's online preview publication, I received calls from executives at companies I'd only dreamed of working with. Speaking opportunities at conferences that had seemed impossibly prestigious just months before. Job offers that made my TechVision salary look modest by comparison. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks before the full magazine issue was set to hit newsstands, I received a call from Dr. Patricia Williams, the Chief Technology Officer at Denver General Hospital. "Ms. Martinez, I've been following your work on healthcare data optimization. We have a situation that I think might benefit from your particular expertise." The project she described was massive in scope and critical in importance. Denver General was implementing a new electronic health record system across their entire network, but they were encountering integration problems that threatened to compromise patient care. Traditional consulting firms had proposed solutions that would take months to implement and cost millions of dollars. "What we need," Dr. Williams explained, "is someone who can see the architecture from both the technical and healthcare perspectives. Someone who understands that when these systems fail, people's lives are at risk." The conversation that followed was unlike any professional discussion I'd ever had. Dr. Williams understood the complexity of what I did, appreciated the innovation involved in my solutions, and recognized the potential impact of my work on patient outcomes. She spoke to me as a peer, a fellow professional whose expertise was essential to solving critical problems. "I'd like to offer you a consulting contract that would be the largest single project of your career," she said. But more importantly, it would be an opportunity to literally save lives through better system design. The scope of the project was staggering. Redesigning data architecture for the largest hospital network in Colorado, affecting hundreds of thousands of patients and thousands of healthcare workers. The timeline was aggressive, the technical challenges were complex, and the visibility would be enormous. Success would establish me as one of the top healthcare technology architects in the country. Failure would be public, devastating, and potentially harmful to patients who depended on these systems working flawlessly. Everything I'd learned about playing it safe, about not reaching too high, about being modest in my aspirations, screamed at me to decline. This was exactly the kind of high-stakes, high-visibility project that I'd spent years avoiding. The kind of opportunity that could launch my career into an entirely different stratosphere, or destroy my reputation if anything went wrong. But as I sat in my corner office at TechVision, looking out at the Rocky Mountains, and thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment, I realized that fear was no longer driving my decisions. The family dinner revelation had changed something fundamental about how I saw myself and what I was capable of achieving. "Dr. Williams," I said, "I'd be honored to take on this project." The contract negotiations took 2 weeks, involving lawyers and executives and technical specifications that filled dozens of pages. But when I finally signed the agreement, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete confidence in my ability to deliver something extraordinary. The project would run parallel to my responsibilities at TechVision, with Michael's full support and encouragement. He understood that success on this scale would benefit not just my career, but TechVision's reputation and future opportunities. "This is exactly what I hoped would happen when I hired you," he said, reviewing the contract details. "You're not just solving problems for individual companies anymore, you're influencing how entire industries approach digital transformation." As news of the Denver General contract spread through the tech community, the dynamic of every professional relationship I had began to shift. Colleagues who had previously seen me as a competent individual contributor now recognized me as someone operating at the executive level. Competitors who had dismissed my work as niche specialization suddenly viewed me as a serious threat to their market dominance. The magazine issue finally hit newsstands on a Tuesday morning in early December. Emma texted me a photo of herself holding a copy at the downtown newsstand where she bought her morning coffee. "Front page of Business Weekly," her message read. "My best friend is officially famous." But the reaction that mattered most came that evening, when my phone rang with a call from my parents. "Jessica," Mom said, and her voice carried an emotion I'd never heard before, something between pride and awe. "We just got back from the grocery store. Your magazine is everywhere." The clerk asked if we were related to the Jessica Martinez on the cover, because we have the same last name. "And what did you tell her?" I asked. "We told her you were our daughter." Dad's voice came through the speaker, thick with pride. "Our daughter who's changing how hospitals take care of patients. Our daughter who's on the cover of Business Weekly." That night, I sat in my apartment looking at my own image on the magazine cover, reading the article that described my innovations and achievements in terms that even my parents could understand and appreciate. The shy middle daughter who had hidden her success behind modest explanations and self-deprecating humor was gone, replaced by someone who claimed her expertise confidently and publicly. The next morning brought a new challenge that would test everything I'd learned about stepping into visibility and authority. Dr. Williams called with an urgent request. "Jessica, we need to move up the timeline on the system implementation. We've had a security breach in our current system, and we need your new architecture operational within 6 weeks instead of 6 months. 6 weeks to implement a project that typically took 6 months. 6 weeks to prove that my confidence wasn't misplaced, that my reputation was built on substance rather than skillful marketing. 6 weeks to either establish myself as one of the most capable architects in the industry, or confirm everyone's worst fears about people who reach too high too quickly." "Dr. Williams," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was asking, "we'll make it work." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the scared, insecure daughter who had sat quietly through family dinners was truly gone. In her place stood someone who welcomed challenges instead of avoiding them, who trusted her abilities instead of doubting them, who understood that hiding talent served no one. The real work was just beginning. The phone call came at 11 p.m. on a Thursday, just as I was reviewing the final testing protocols for the Denver General implementation. It was Mom, her voice breathless with excitement. "Jessica, you need to turn on Channel 7 News right now. They're doing a story about the hospital system, and they mentioned your name." I grabbed the remote, switching to the local news just as the anchor was introducing a segment about Denver General's revolutionary new patient data system. The reporter stood outside the hospital, explaining how a critical security breach had threatened patient care until a local software architect designed an entirely new system in record time. The architect behind this breakthrough is Jessica Martinez, recently featured on the cover of Business Weekly magazine, the reporter said. Hospital administrators credit her innovative approach with not only solving their immediate crisis, but potentially saving lives through improved data access and security. The story cut to an interview with Dr. Williams, who spoke about the project with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for medical breakthroughs. "Ms. Martinez didn't just fix our problems," Dr. Williams explained. "She reimagined how hospital data systems could work. Patient information that used to take minutes to access now appears instantly. Security protocols that were vulnerable are now impenetrable. This isn't just an upgrade, it's a transformation." My phone was buzzing with texts from Sarah, Kevin, Emma, and colleagues at TechVision. But the most meaningful message came from Dad, watching the news. "So proud I could cry. Our daughter is a hero." The next morning brought something I never could have anticipated. Michael called me into his office, where I found him sitting with 3 people I didn't recognize, all wearing expensive suits and carrying themselves with the confidence of serious money. "Jessica, I'd like you to meet the partners from Pinnacle Venture Capital. They saw the news coverage last night and flew in from San Francisco this morning." The lead partner, a woman named Catherine Reed, stood to shake my hand. "Ms. Martinez, we've been following your work since the Business Weekly article. The Denver General project demonstrates exactly the kind of innovation we're looking for." What followed was a conversation that redefined everything I thought I knew about my career trajectory. Pinnacle wasn't just interested in hiring me or investing in TechVision. They wanted to fund my own company, with me as CEO of a healthcare technology firm focused on the kind of system architecture I'd pioneered. "We're prepared to offer initial funding of $12 million, Catherine said, sliding a term sheet across Michael's conference table. "With additional rounds of financing as you scale the operation. $12 million. To start my own company. To hire my own team. To transform an entire industry using innovations I'd developed, while everyone assumed I was fixing broken computers." The meeting lasted 3 hours, covering everything from intellectual property rights to market expansion strategies. By the time the venture capitalists left, I had commitments for funding, partnership offers from major hospital networks, and a timeline for launching Martinez Healthcare Technologies within 6 months. Michael walked me back to my office, his expression mixing pride with something that looked like amazement. "You know what's remarkable about this?" he said. 6 months ago, you were afraid to take a visible position because you thought you might not be ready. Now you're about to become the CEO of a company that could revolutionize healthcare technology." That evening, I drove to my parents' house for what had become our new tradition: weekly family dinners where I was no longer the invisible daughter but a contributing member whose opinions and experiences mattered. But this dinner was different. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed several neighbors gathered on their front porches, pointing and waving. Mrs. Patterson from next door actually applauded as I got out of my car. "Jessica," she called out, "we saw you on the news. The whole neighborhood is so proud." Inside, I found my entire extended family waiting. Aunts, uncles, cousins who usually only appeared for major holidays. The dining room had been expanded with card tables to accommodate everyone, and the good china had been supplemented with Mom's best serving pieces. "There she is," Uncle Roberto announced as I walked in. "Our family's celebrity." The evening that followed was unlike any family gathering I'd ever experienced. Instead of sitting quietly while others shared their achievements, I found myself at the center of animated conversations about technology, business strategy, and healthcare innovation. Relatives who had previously offered gentle advice about finding stability were now asking for career guidance and business insights. Cousin Maria, who managed a small medical clinic, pulled me aside to discuss how my innovations might help rural healthcare facilities. My teenage nephew asked detailed questions about software engineering, suddenly considering computer science as a college major. Even Grandma Carmen, who had never used anything more complicated than a microwave, wanted to understand how my work was helping doctors take better care of their patients. But the moment that crystallized everything came when Dad stood up to make a toast. 32 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the crowded room, Linda and I welcomed our middle daughter into the world. We had dreams for Jessica, hopes about what she might accomplish, but honestly, we never imagined anything like this. He paused, looking directly at me with eyes that held decades of love and, for the first time, complete understanding. We thought we were raising a daughter who would need our protection and guidance throughout her life. Instead, we raised a daughter who protects and guides thousands of people she's never met, whose innovations make their lives better and safer. The room fell silent as he lifted his glass. To Jessica Martinez, Chief Executive Officer of Martinez Healthcare Technologies, cover story of Business Weekly magazine, and the daughter who taught us that sometimes the people we love most are capable of far more than we ever imagined possible. As glasses clinked around the expanded dining room, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete acceptance and celebration from the people who had raised me. Not tolerance for my choices or worried support for my decisions, but genuine admiration for what I'd built and pride in who I'd become. The disappointment they'd expressed just months earlier seemed like it belonged to a different family entirely. In its place was something I'd spent my entire adult life hoping for: recognition, respect, and the knowledge that I was finally seen clearly by the people who mattered most. Later that night, as I drove home through Denver's glittering downtown, past the TechVision building where I'd learned to claim my expertise, and toward the apartment where I'd spent years hiding my success, I realized that the greatest transformation hadn't been in my career or my bank account. It had been in finally understanding that being underestimated was only powerful if you used it as motivation to prove everyone wrong, including yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.